My cheating wife called me 5 years after the divorce. Her name appeared on the phone's display, a ghost from the past I hoped I'd never see again. When I answered, the sound of her voice was the first shock. That same soft voice, almost sweet, but with a heavy load, an apology camouflaged by an attempt to return to what could never be recovered. She wanted to talk, wanted to see me. He asked for more than forgiveness, he begged for a second chance. The tone was contrite but not sincere. I knew that woman well, perhaps even better than she knew herself. Years ago, I loved her with an intensity that blinded me to her flaws, to the obvious signs of her infidelity. And when the truth finally came out, it destroyed me in a way I never thought possible. Seeing her face, her impassive expression as she admitted to the affair with another man, made me question everything about who we were, everything about who I was. For 5 long years, I rebuilt my life. It wasn't easy. I started from scratch, rising with each blow that her memory still gave me. And now, here she was, back, as if nothing had happened, as if it were possible to erase the past with a few words of regret. I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it back. I felt a bitter laugh escape my lips. Go back. Did she really believe things could go back to the way they were? Her betrayal wasn't just a mistake, it was a calculated choice, a cold decision to put her desires above our lives, above everything we've built. I looked out the window as her voice echoed on the other end, and all I could feel was contempt. Do you really think that matters now? My voice was firm, filled with a coldness that I didn't even know I possessed. He finished. There is no turning back. She was silent for a few seconds. And then the order came. She wanted to see me, come to my house, talk in person. I wanted to explain myself, try to somehow justify the unjustifiable. But I'm no longer that man she manipulated, that she deceived with empty promises. My life changed. I have changed. And the mere idea of her stepping into my home, into the space that I now shared with another woman, repulsed me. Don't even think about coming here, I warned. If you show up, you'll regret it. I hung up the phone before she could respond, adrenaline rushing through my body, my thoughts tumultuous as the past and present collided. 5 years of silence, 5 years without a word, and now this? What did she really want? It didn't take long for the doorbell to ring. I knew, without needing to look, who was on the other side of the door. But this time, she wouldn't have the power to shake me. The woman who was next to me today, my current wife, knew exactly who she was. And I wasn't willing to allow ghosts from the past to cross the door we kept closed to any kind of old pain. Before I could say anything, I heard my most recent wife's voice echo firmly through the house, facing the past with a strength I had never imagined. She opened the door and, with frightening calm, shut her ex out of our lives once again. But there was something wrong. Something I hadn't realized until that moment. The reason behind my ex-wife's sudden regret, her plea for a second chance, wasn't just regret or guilt. There was something darker behind his actions. Something she didn't tell me. Something that I would soon discover, and that would change everything I thought I knew. And at that moment, I asked myself, what is she hiding now? Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support cheating, on the contrary, our fictional stories show how infidelity can devastate lives and destroy relationships. The goal is to reveal the real and painful consequences of selfish choices. So, get ready, because what you're going to hear now is an intense story, full of twists and turns that will keep your attention until the end. Take a deep breath and dive into this shocking plot. Good story. The air was heavy that afternoon, almost like an omen. John paced the living room, distracted by the thoughts that had accompanied him for the last week. The soft light that passed through the windows reflected on the neutral-toned walls, creating an atmosphere of calm. Lindsay, his wife, was preparing dinner in the kitchen, while he watched the garden through the glass door that led to the backyard. It was there, in that home, that he had finally found peace, after years of emotional storms. John and Lindsay met unexpectedly. After the end of his previous marriage to Rachel, he didn't imagine he could find someone again with whom to build a new life. But Lindsay appeared as a breath of fresh air. She was different, serene and strong, with a presence that balanced her insecurities and past wounds. There was no room for the drama or doubts that consumed her previous relationship. With her, things were clear. The life they had built together had a solid foundation, without the ups and downs he had experienced before. And he appreciated that stability more than anything else. John, by nature, was an introspective man. He spent a large part of his life seeking professional success and, despite having achieved much more than he had dreamed of, he always felt that something was missing. When he met Rachel, years ago, he believed she was the missing piece to complete his life. She was a stunning woman, full of charm and energy, but also full of secrets and uncertainties that John, at the time, ignored. Their marriage had been intense, passionate, but also chaotic. There was an intensity between them that, at first, seemed romantic, but that gradually turned into an emotional roller coaster that John couldn't get off. After the divorce, John swore to himself that he would never allow himself to go through that again. He promised that next time he would be more careful, that he wouldn't let his feelings blind him. It was this promise that brought him and Lindsay closer. She was everything Rachel wasn't: calm, patient, and most of all, trustworthy. With Lindsay, he found the peace of mind he so desperately needed. Their relationship, unlike the previous one, was based on mutual trust and respect. There were no games, no lies, no cheating, and that was exactly what John was looking for. Lindsay knew John's story. She knew the emotional scars he carried, and always strived to be the opposite of what he experienced before. For her, marriage was a partnership, a real commitment to care for each other, with no room for failure. She was a practical woman, someone who put emotional security above all else. Despite being reserved, she had an inner strength that sustained John in his most difficult times. Lindsay was the rock he leaned on, and that stability was what kept their relationship so strong. As Lindsay finished cutting the vegetables, she watched John through the window. He seemed lost in thought, but she knew it was just his way. Although he rarely spoke openly about the past, Lindsay was sure the memories still haunted him. It wasn't easy for John to trust fully again, and she knew it. But for her, every small step forward, every moment of vulnerability he shared, was a victory. She loved him for that, for his complexity, for being a man who tried, every day, to leave the past behind. John sighed deeply, pushing the thoughts from his mind. He knew he was in a better place now. His life with Lindsay was peaceful, but not boring. They had created a routine together that worked, a harmony that, for many, might seem simple, but for him it was all he needed. Work was going well, the house was in order, and his plans for the future with Lindsay were clear and stable. There was no more room for the chaos he knew so well. John's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The name on the display froze him for a moment. Rachel. He stood still, staring at the name he hadn't seen in years. 5 years, to be exact. There was something surreal about seeing that name again, almost as if it belonged to another life. He hesitated before answering, but something inside him, perhaps a repressed curiosity, made him slide his finger across the screen, connecting the call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but it carried a tone he hadn't expected. Rachel seemed nervous, even a little desperate. She started with a little talk, almost as if she was trying to measure the terrain, and then finally got to the point. I wanted to see him. I wanted to talk. The word hung heavy in the air between them. John listened silently as she tried to explain, her words mixed between regret and barely concealed pleas. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Why now? Why would she decide to reappear after all this time? There was a coldness in his voice when he responded. I was no longer willing to play the same games, fall into the same traps. Rachel had made her choice a long time ago, and he had spent too much time trying to erase the scars she left. "There's no turning back," he said, cutting off any attempt she had to continue. The silence on the other end of the line was palpable. He knew his words had hit the target. Without saying goodbye, he hung up. As John walked away from the phone, a strange feeling came over him. It was as if, even after so many years, Rachel still had the power to shake his peace. He hated to admit it, but part of his old life with her was still deeply embedded in his memories. It was like a wound that, although healed, could still be reopened with the slightest touch. Lindsay knew something was wrong as soon as she saw John put away his phone. Her ever-watchful eyes caught the change in her expression, but she didn't say anything right away. She knew that when he was ready, he would tell her. "Everything is fine?" she asked, her voice calm but full of concern. John nodded, but she knew he wasn't being completely honest. It wasn't unusual for him to avoid talking about topics that upset him, but she also knew he would eventually give in. He always gave in. But that night, John said no more about the matter. He lay down next to Lindsay, wrapped in thoughts he didn't want to share. Rachel's call, although short, had awakened something in him. Something he thought he had overcome. And as he closed his eyes, he tried to shake off the feeling that this story, somehow, hadn't ended yet. The days following that unexpected call from Rachel dragged on with almost palpable tension. John tried, in vain, to maintain the normal rhythm of his life. The routine with Lindsay hadn't changed, but something inside him was different. The phone call from his ex-wife opened a fissure in his past, and as much as he tried to ignore it, he felt Rachel's silent presence hovering over him like a shadow. Lindsay, perceptive as ever, noticed John's growing distance. She didn't push, but the atmosphere at home was starting to take its toll. Every time she saw him deep in thought, she wondered what was going on in her husband's head, but preferred not to force a confrontation. She trusted him. He knew the love they shared and believed that any problem, no matter how big, could be resolved with time. Still, there was a nagging feeling in the back of her mind, something she couldn't name, but it was there, latent. One afternoon, John decided to leave work early. He needed time alone, away from the pressure of his daily commitments and, most importantly, away from Lindsay's worried eyes. He got in the car and drove aimlessly through the streets, his thoughts spinning in circles. Why is Rachel back now? What would be the real reason? Something in her voice, in the urgency with which she spoke, bothered him deeply. Maybe there was more to that phone call than just regret. Without realizing it, John found himself parked in front of a cafe he used to frequent before the divorce. It was there, at one of those tables, that Rachel convinced him that they could overcome anything together, right before everything fell apart. Entering that place brought back memories he would have preferred to leave buried. Sitting at a table near the window, he ordered a coffee and watched people pass by on the sidewalk. He tried to concentrate, but his mind kept going back to Rachel. The phone vibrated in his coat pocket. For a moment, John hesitated before answering, fearing it was her again. But when he saw Lindsay's name on the screen, he answered with immediate relief. "Hi, love," he said, trying to sound more excited than he actually was. "Hi," Lindsay replied, her voice soft. "I just wanted to know if you're okay. You left without warning. I just needed some time alone. Trying to clear my head." "I see," she said, and there was a pause. "I trust you, John. I just don't want you to walk away from me." Those words hit him in a way he didn't expect. He knew Lindsay was being sincere, but there was something she didn't know, something he was afraid to say. They talked some more, and then he hung up, feeling even heavier. John returned home late that night, his head still spinning around the same questions. Lindsay was already in bed, but he knew she wasn't sleeping. She waited for him, always patient, always willing to understand what was going on in his mind. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't know if he could share everything he was feeling. That same night, while trying to sleep, John had a disturbing dream. He found himself back in the house he shared with Rachel. Memories of the past mixed with distorted images, and he woke up in the middle of the night, in a cold sweat, with a feeling of anguish that he couldn't explain. He looked at Lindsay, who was sleeping peacefully next to him, and a feeling of guilt invaded him. Why was he letting Rachel take up so much space in his thoughts? However, what John didn't know was that Rachel's visit was inevitable. A few days later, while he was at work, Lindsay was startled by the sound of the doorbell. When he opened the door, he found Rachel, standing there, with an uncomfortable smile on her lips. Lindsay stood still for a moment, surprised by the boldness of the woman who, years before, had destroyed John's heart. "I need to talk to John," Rachel said bluntly. Lindsay looked at her, maintaining her composure, although inside her heart was beating faster. She knew who that woman was, and she knew the damage she had already caused in the life of the man she loved. "John isn't in," Lindsay replied firmly, without moving a muscle. "And I think you've said everything you had to say." Rachel took a step forward, as if she was about to insist, but Lindsay stood her ground, blocking the entrance to the house. "Do you really think you can erase everything that happened?" Rachel said, with a sarcastic tone in her voice. "He will never love you like he loved me." Those words hit Lindsay, but she didn't back down. She knew Rachel was trying to destabilize her, trying to bring up insecurities she didn't even know she had. But Lindsay refused to give in. She simply looked at Rachel and, with calculated calm, said, "Go away. You don't belong in this life anymore." Rachel hesitated for a moment, perhaps expecting a different reaction. But, when he saw that he wouldn't get what he wanted, he gave a half-smile and turned around, leaving without saying anything else. When John got home that night, Lindsay decided to tell him what had happened. He listened in silence, feeling the tension build within him. Something about Rachel was wrong. Something he couldn't put into words, but knew would soon be revealed. It was then that, during dinner a few days later, Lindsay directly confronted him. "John, I can't ignore this anymore," she said, placing her fork on the table. "You're not here, are you? Your head is somewhere else." John looked at her, feeling the weight of truth approaching. He knew he was hiding things from Lindsay, but he didn't know how to begin to explain. "Rachel showed up here," she continued. "She said things that made me question everything. I trust you, but I need to know if you're with me or still stuck in the past." John felt the pressure in his chest increase. He loved Lindsay, but Rachel's return had stirred up a whirlwind of emotions he thought he had overcome. And at that moment, he knew he could no longer run away from the truth. "I don't know what to do," he confessed, his voice low. "But I know Rachel didn't come back by chance. She wants something." Lindsay watched him for a long moment, waiting for him to say more, but he fell silent. The feeling that something bigger was coming hung over them, like a storm about to break. John knew that the truth about what Rachel had done in the past, the betrayal that devastated him, was about to come out again. But what he didn't know was that the reason for his return was shrouded in even deeper secrets, secrets that he would soon discover. That night would be definitive. John knew this before he even set foot in the house. The weight of his last conversation with Lindsay still echoed in his mind, and he couldn't ignore the whirlwind of emotions that took over him. Something had changed since Rachel's phone call, something he could no longer control. Lindsay felt it, he felt it. The past, which he believed to be buried, was more alive than ever, ready to tear away the scars and reveal unhealed wounds. He entered the house in silence, the air feeling heavier than usual. Lindsay was in the living room, sitting on the couch, looking lost. When he entered, she looked up but didn't smile. There was a distance between them, an invisible barrier that had been growing in recent weeks. "We need to talk, John." Her voice was firm, but there was an underlying sadness that he recognized. It was the same sadness he had felt when he discovered Rachel's betrayal years ago, the same feeling that something important was about to fall apart. He just nodded and sat down next to her, waiting for the words to come, not knowing where to start. I know something's up, Lindsay said, breaking the silence. And there's no point in denying it. Ever since Rachel called, you haven't been the same. He looked at her, trying to find an answer. I knew she was right. Everything had changed, and as much as I wanted to avoid it, I could no longer hide what I felt. He couldn't keep pretending that Rachel wasn't back in his life. She showed up again, he began, his voice low, thick with guilt. Rachel doesn't just want to talk. She wants something from me, and I don't know what it is. Lindsay sighed, her eyes filling with silent pain. She always knew Rachel's return would bring problems, but she never imagined it would affect their relationship so much. And what hurt her most was the fact that John was allowing this to happen. And what do you want, John? Her question hung in the air for a few seconds. Do you want to hear what she has to say? Do you want to go back to the past? That's not it, he replied quickly. I don't want to go back. But I feel like there's something more. Something I don't understand yet. Rachel never comes back without a reason. Silence took over the room for a few moments, until Lindsay got up, walking towards the window. John watched her from afar, feeling the tension rising between them. I knew I was about to lose something very important, but I didn't know how to avoid it. I need to know something, John, she said, without turning to him. Are you still hung up on what happened to her? Or are you here, with me? The question hit John hard. He stood up and walked over to her, hesitating before touching her shoulder. Lindsay turned slowly, her eyes fixed on his, waiting for an answer she feared she wouldn't receive. I'm with you, he said, voice a little shaky. But Rachel, she knows how to mess with me. She always knew. And now, she's back, and I don't know how to deal with it. Lindsay grabbed John's hands, squeezing them tightly, as if to stop him from moving any further away. She knew their love was real, but Rachel's return was bringing up insecurities she thought she'd overcome. The fear of losing John, of him being seduced again by that dark past, was overwhelming. You have to choose, she said, her voice low and thick with emotion. Either you stay with the past, or build the future with me. But I can't compete with ghosts. John closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the coming choice. He knew Rachel was part of his past, a chapter he no longer wanted to relive, but at the same time, something about her return made him uneasy. There was more to the story than regret, he knew. And that's when the phone rang again. Lindsay released him, and John walked over to the device. He didn't need to see the name on the display to know who was calling. He answered without hesitation, and Rachel's voice filled the room. We need to talk, John. Personally. I have nothing to talk to you about, Rachel, he replied, trying to maintain control. Yes, you do, she insisted. You don't understand, but I need to see you. It's important. I made a lot of mistakes, but there's something you need to know. John hesitated for a moment, but before he could respond, Lindsay interrupted him. Let her come, she said, her tone surprisingly calm. Does she want to talk? So talk. But let it be once and for all. John looked at Lindsay, surprised by the firmness in her voice. He didn't want Rachel to come, but maybe it was the only way to resolve this once and for all. Reluctantly, he agreed. You have 30 minutes, he said, his tone cold. After that, we're done. Rachel arrived within minutes. The tension in the air was palpable. John opened the door and allowed her to enter, but he remained distant, watching every movement, every expression. Lindsay was sitting on the couch, staring at Rachel, without a word. Rachel looked different. There was something desperate in her posture, something John had never seen in her before. She had always been confident, manipulative, but now she seemed on the verge of a breakdown. Why are you here, Rachel? John was direct, without beating around the bush. Rachel sighed deeply, as if preparing to reveal something painful. She looked at Lindsay, then at John, and began to speak. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice cracking at first. "I made a lot of mistakes. And when I betrayed you, John, I knew I was destroying what we had. But, what I never told you is why I did it." Lindsay crossed her arms, keeping her posture firm. John, on the other hand, felt his heart racing. He had never demanded explanations before. The betrayal, for him, was enough to sever all ties. But now, with Rachel there, finally willing to talk, he realized he needed to listen. "I cheated on you because I was lost," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I was looking for something I didn't even know what it was. And in the process, I lost everything. I lost you. But what you don't know, what you never knew, is what happened next." Rachel looked straight at John, her eyes shining with tears she was trying to hold back. Lindsay remained silent, watching the scene with a mixture of curiosity and pain. "I made bad investments, John. I thought I could support myself, that I didn't need you or anyone else. But I was wrong. I lost everything. I'm broke." The silence that followed was heavy. John felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of anger and compassion. He knew something was wrong, but he didn't expect it. Rachel, who had always been so self-sufficient, so sure of herself, now stood before him, stripped of all that arrogance he knew so well. "Are you here because you want help?" Lindsay's voice was finally heard. She was cold, direct, but without cruelty. Rachel didn't respond right away. She looked at the floor, as if she was finding the strength to admit something she never wanted to say. "I have nothing left," he finally confessed. "And I know I have no right to ask anything of you, John, but I have nowhere else to turn." John felt the ground open beneath his feet. He didn't know how to respond. All the anger, all the hurt he had carried for so long seemed insignificant now, in the face of Rachel's vulnerability. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't just ignore everything that happened. He built a new life. He had Lindsay. And as much as he felt compassion, he couldn't allow Rachel to destroy what he had achieved. Lindsay watched everything carefully. She knew this was the decisive moment. Rachel's presence there, the revelation of her bankruptcy, all of this could change the course of their lives. But deep down, she knew the decision was in John's hands. And then, with a deep sigh, John turned to Rachel, his voice firmer than it had ever been. "I'm so sorry for what you went through, Rachel. In truth. But you made your choice a long time ago. I'm not part of it anymore." Rachel looked at him, pain clear on her face. She knew he was right, but the reality of her situation crushed her. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he continued, taking a step back. "But it's not me." And with those words, he walked away, ending the last chapter of his story with Rachel. The silence that followed Rachel's departure hung in the air like an invisible, crushing weight. John closed the door behind her, letting out not just a person, but a chapter of his life that, for years, he believed he had closed. However, the echo of her presence still reverberated in his mind. He stood there, still for a moment, his hand still resting on the doorknob, as if it could ground him in reality, helping him process everything that had just happened. Lindsay was in the room, watching John's every move with calm but tense attention. She didn't say anything right away, and he felt her gaze weigh heavily on him as he walked away from the door and approached her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. The weight of the night was still there, and they both knew it had been a test, for John, for Lindsay, and for their relationship. "She left," John finally said, breaking the silence, as if that would be enough to end any argument. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Lindsay didn't respond right away. Her eyes never left him, assessing him, trying to measure what had changed inside him, if anything had changed. She didn't want to be the first to speak, she didn't want to seem too vulnerable in that moment, but the uncertainty she felt was overwhelming. After a few seconds, she took a deep breath and, with a soft but firm tone, said, "And what does that mean now, John? Did you really let her go?" The question, although simple, carried an emotional weight he hadn't expected. John knew the answer wouldn't be easy, because even though Rachel was physically out of their lives, her impact was still there. He felt the moral dilemma tightening his chest, the compassion he still felt for the woman who was once part of his life, against the need to protect what he now had with Lindsay. "I did," he replied, his voice low but honest. "But I can't pretend I don't care. Rachel is lost. And as much as she made choices that put her in this situation, she is still a human being, someone who was part of my life for a long time." Lindsay looked away for a moment, trying to process what he had just said. She knew John wasn't an insensitive man, and that was part of what she loved about him. He always cared about others, even those who hurt him. But right now, she needed to know where exactly she stood in this equation. "And me?" Lindsay asked, her voice finally breaking with an emotion she had been holding back. "Where does that leave us, John? I understand that you have compassion for her, but what about us? Did you really manage to close that door?" John felt the blow of her question as a wave of guilt shot through him. He knew that for Lindsay, Rachel's return was a threat, proof that the shadows of the past could resurface at any moment and destroy what they had built. And he couldn't blame her for that. He walked up to her and, without saying anything, held her hands, looking straight into her eyes. For a few seconds, they were both silent, until John finally found the words he needed to say. "I choose you, Lindsay," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was still fluttering. "I choose our life, what we build. What happened to Rachel is the past, and I won't let it destroy us. I feel compassion for her, yes, but that doesn't change what I want for us." Lindsay watched his face for a few moments, looking for some confirmation in his words. She wanted to believe, wanted to trust that this would be enough to end the cycle of insecurities that Rachel's return had brought. But she also knew that the situation was not that simple. There was something deeper in John's heart that was still being processed, something that perhaps he himself hadn't yet fully understood. "I believe you," Lindsay replied, her voice soft but cautious. "But I need you to understand that I'm not going to fight for you against your past. If Rachel is a shadow that's going to hang over us, I can't compete with that." John nodded slowly, feeling the weight of those words. He knew he was at a crucial point. There was a fine line between compassion and involvement, and he needed to make sure he didn't cross that line again. "There's no competition," John said decisively. "What we had, Lindsay, what we have now, is the only thing that matters to me." His words brought temporary relief, but the moral dilemma still remained. John knew he couldn't just ignore Rachel's condition, but at the same time, he knew that involving her in any way could be a disaster for their marriage. He was caught between the past and the present, and the choice between acting kindly and protecting his own happiness seemed more complicated than he expected. Lindsay, in turn, realized that the situation was deeper than a simple reunion. There was an emotional wound that needed to be addressed, not just with words, but with actions. She felt that, despite everything, there was still something unsaid, something that was lurking, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The tension that hung in the air could not be resolved with a simple conversation. They both knew they would need time, patience and confidence to overcome that moment. But for the first time, John felt that Rachel's ghost would no longer have the power to destroy what he and Lindsay had built. However, at the same time, he knew that this story was not completely resolved yet. Rachel's presence in his life had been full of twists and turns, and the impact of her return would not be overcome so quickly. The moral dilemma he faced was something only time could answer, and as he prepared to move forward, a part of him still wondered what else was to come. And Lindsay, despite her strength, also knew that the end of that story had not yet come. The silence that fell between them, although comforting at times, still carried the weight of an uncertain future. That night, they both went to bed without saying anything else, each lost in their own thoughts. The cycle of emotions they had experienced seemed to have reached a temporary balance point, but the storm still loomed on the horizon. What they didn't know, however, was that the true resolution of that story was yet to come. As the sound of the night filled the room, John closed his eyes, trying to push away his thoughts. But in the back of his mind, something remained, a question he knew he would soon need to face: how far could his compassion for Rachel take him, and what would it mean for the future he so wanted to protect? And so, the clock ran its course, as the night enveloped the couple in a tense calm, just waiting for the next move that fate would bring. The silence persisted for days after Rachel left. John and Lindsay maintained an almost automatic routine, each caught up in their own thoughts. Even though they had talked and decided that Rachel's presence wouldn't affect them, something hung in the air. It was as if the shadow of an uncertain future was still between them, making moments of intimacy rarer and full of hesitation. But they both knew that, at some point, it would need to be resolved definitively. It was on a rainy afternoon that everything finally fell into place. John had come home early from work, determined to take the next step in putting the past behind him. He had made a decision. He had already spoken to a lawyer, prepared everything he needed to ensure that Rachel, or any trace of her, would no longer be able to invade his life or Lindsay's. But before sharing this with his wife, he needed a moment to himself to process the latest events. He was in the living room, mentally reliving the most tense moments of the last few weeks, when the doorbell rang. His heart sank. An instinctive fear gripped him, as if he knew exactly who was on the other side of the door. When he opened it, the sight of Rachel, drenched in rain, made him stop breathing for a second. She was different. There was no longer the arrogance that once accompanied every gesture, nor the confidence that, for years, had defined her. Before him stood a broken woman, worn down not just by life, but by her own choices. His eyes, empty and desperate, searched for a trace of compassion in him. "Please, John," her voice was shaky, almost unrecognizable. I have nowhere else to go." He closed his eyes for a second, breathing deeply, before taking a step outside, feeling the rain wet his face. He knew that, at that moment, any decision he made would change everything, not just for him, but for Lindsay as well. Rachel's words echoed in his mind, but this time, they didn't shake him like before. He was prepared. "Rachel," he began, his voice firm but without cruelty. "I'm sorry it's come to this. But you need to understand that I can't help you anymore." Her eyes filled with tears, and John could clearly see the weight of bankruptcy she was carrying. It wasn't just a financial failure, it was emotional, moral. Rachel had nowhere else to go, but he knew that letting her into his life again would destroy everything he had rebuilt. "I can offer you nothing but compassion," he continued. "And compassion won't save you. You need to find your way, but it's not here." Rachel shook her head, despair growing on her face. "John, please. I don't have anyone else." Before he could respond, Lindsay appeared in the doorway. His presence was like a reminder of everything that was at stake, of everything he had chosen. She didn't say a word, just observed the scene with a firm and determined gaze. John knew this was his last chance to end the cycle with Rachel. "Rachel, you need to go," Lindsay said finally. His voice wasn't anger, but certainty. "What you're looking for isn't here. John has made his choice, and you need to make yours." The rain continued to fall, and for a moment, all that could be heard was the sound of heavy drops hitting the ground. Rachel, for the first time, seemed to accept what was happening. Her resistance broke once and for all, and she took a step back, enveloped by the sadness and loneliness that accompanied her. She looked at John one last time, but there was no more pleading in her eyes, just resignation. Without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the rain. John stood there for a few seconds, watching her leave, feeling relief mixed with a weight he didn't know he was carrying. He turned to Lindsay, feeling that this moment demanded something more. She looked at him with a look that mixed understanding and strength. There was no doubt in their eyes, just a silent certainty that they had overcome the last hurdle. And it was at that moment, under the rain, that John realized how much he loved Lindsay, how much that woman was the pillar of everything he had built. "It is done," said John, with a sigh. She left. Lindsay approached, holding her hands, and together they entered the house, leaving the last shadow of Rachel behind. The cycle had finally ended. In the days that followed, things began to return to normal. Life took its course, and Rachel's presence became just a distant memory. John and Lindsay knew they had been through a difficult test, but they were stronger than ever. Lindsay, in particular, felt safer. She knew that John had made the right choice, that he hadn't let Rachel's shadow destroy what they had. And as they both moved forward, a new sense of hope filled the house. For Rachel, however, it was a different story. The void she had tried to fill with betrayal, selfishness, and later despair finally consumed her. Aimless, without support, she found herself trapped in a cycle that seemed to have no end. The world she built on selfish decisions had crumbled, and now, she was alone, facing the consequences of her own choices. While John and Lindsay moved on, Rachel wandered, lost, directionless, realizing too late that she had gambled everything and lost. She had chosen to destroy, and now, she paid the price. There was no redemption for her. And so, life settled down. John and Lindsay, more united than ever, built the future they so desired. The past, with all its scars and ghosts, had been overcome, and now, only peace remained. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to comment your opinion. We want to know what you think about how the characters' choices impacted the end of their lives. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Remember, we never support cheating of any kind. The objective here is to show how infidelity can destroy lives and relationships. Until next time.